police hope will help crack the case of a murdered girl in Colorado. 10-year-old Jessica Ridgeway was kidnapped and killed on her way to school earlier this month. Police are hoping by making their evidence public that they'll get justice for little Jessica.
It looks like it was cut, whether by hand or by machine, out of a solid block of wood. That it was left behind or dropped by somebody that was involved and knows information that we're looking for.
Left intentionally, perhaps?
It potentially was left intentionally.
We recognize that there is a predator at large in our community.
Go to a friend's house and still you don't hear anything, and then you get the pit in your stomach that you don't want any parent to ever experience in their whole entire life, that you know your child has just been taken.
It is by far the worst thing I've ever been through. It still is. I was at work. It was about time to get off work, and I got a phone call telling me that they'd found her backpack and her water bottle.
Hi, welcome to Crime Daily Series. Today we are talking about story of missing Jessica Ridgeway, Westminster, Colorado. Tucked comfortably between Denver and Boulder, Stanley Lake catches fire at sunset. Long trails follow Big Dry Creek through the suburbs. Families jog the promenade on weekday evenings. Quiet, familiar, safe. That's what made what happened here so difficult to process. On the morning of October 5th, 2012, a 10-year-old girl kissed her mother goodbye, walked out the front door, and vanished. Not in the middle of the night, not in some dark, unfamiliar place. In broad daylight on a road she had walked every single day, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Her name was Jessica Ridgeway. Within hours, an entire city was holding its breath. Mailboxes and trees across Westminster were wrapped in purple ribbons, her favorite color. More than 1,000 law enforcement officers and volunteers would eventually work this case. More than 4,000 tips would come in. And 19 days after she disappeared, the investigation would end in a way nobody had anticipated. Not a stranger caught fleeing the state, not an anonymous tip from someone who had seen something suspicious weeks earlier, but a confession, made to a mother, at the kitchen table, in a house less than half a mile from where Jessica had last been seen alive. Before we go back to that Friday morning, if you're new here, welcome to the Crime Daily Series. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this case has one of the most complicated, most emotionally devastating endings I've ever had to research for this channel, and we're not skipping any of it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I always want to know how far these stories travel. Okay, let's go back to who Jessica actually was. Jessica Ridgeway was born to Sarah and Jeremiah, two parents who, despite going their separate ways years earlier, never stopped putting their daughter first. Jeremiah had since moved to Missouri, and like a lot of families navigating distance and custody arrangements, things weren't always simple. But by every account, Jessica had real relationships with both parents. She was loved deeply from two directions at once. She lived in Westminster with her mom, her grandmother, and her aunt. And if you'd asked anyone who knew her to describe her in one word, that word was probably joy. Teachers called her radiant, always smiling, always the first hand in the air, always ready to make a new friend, just by starting a conversation. She didn't just show up to school, she genuinely wanted to be there. Her friends described her as the kind of person who made you feel like she'd been waiting specifically for you to show up. She was a 5th grader at Witt Elementary. She loved math, wore pink and purple glasses, and was on a Pee-wee cheerleading squad, a sport she took seriously enough that one of the last things she'd told her mom was that she was going to be a cheerleader who was kind to everyone, no matter what. She was 10 years old and already thinking about what kind of person she wanted to be. Outside the classroom, she made up dance routines, invented songs out of thin air, and was obsessed with animals. She watched Victorious and Wizards of Waverly Place, and once she decided she wanted to learn something, she didn't stop until she had it figured out. Determination at 10 years old. She was planning to be a zombie lifeguard for Halloween. Her grandmother later recalled the morning of October 5th, 2012, with the kind of detail that only grief keeps sharp. Jessica woke up at 7:45 a.m. She'd recently asked her mom to buy her an alarm clock. She wanted to start waking herself up independently. That was so her. She watched a little television, ate a granola bar, changed her clothes. Then she and her mom sat together and peeled an orange for her to take to school. She bundled up in her coat, said goodbye, and walked out the door. The plan was straightforward. Walk to Chelsea Park, about 5 minutes from home, meet her friends at their usual spot, and head to school together. She did it all the time. It was routine. She never showed up at the park. Visual cue. Soft neighborhood establishing shots. Suburban Colorado in autumn. A yellow school bus. A front yard. Build warmth before the turn. Quick one before we keep going. Drop in the comments where you're watching this from today. This case made national headlines almost immediately back in 2012, so I'm curious how many of you followed it in real time versus hearing the full story for the first time right now. All right, back to that Friday morning. Her friends waited at the park as long as they could. When Jessica didn't show up, they kept walking. They didn't want to be late for school. Nobody thought much of it at first. Kids run a few minutes behind sometimes. Except with Jessica. Things like this just didn't happen. She was never late. She never missed a day without telling someone. Sarah had worked the night shift, 10 in the evening straight through to 7 in the morning. After walking Jessica to the door, she'd gone straight to bed. She didn't hear the school's call when it came in around 10 o'clock. The voicemail sat there, unheard, for hours. At 4:30 that afternoon, Sarah finally listened to it. Her first instinct was that there had to be some kind of mistake. She drove past Chelsea Park, stopped by the school, knocked on doors at her friends' houses. Nobody had seen her. Nobody knew anything. And that's when she called the Westminster Police Department. "My daughter's missing. I guess she never made it to school this morning." The dispatcher walked her through it. Name, age, height, what she was wearing. A black puffy jacket, her pink and purple glasses, the clothes she'd had on that morning. She was 10 years old, 4'10", and she hadn't been seen since she walked out her front door. There's a moment every parent dreads without ever fully letting themselves imagine it. That cold, sinking feeling when you realize your child didn't just wander off. By 9:15 that same evening, investigators had seen enough. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation issued an Amber Alert for Jessica Ridgeway. The delay between when she'd last been seen and when the alert went out, roughly 8 hours, was already significant. Investigators were clear-eyed about what that meant. The search radius that had to be covered was enormous. The window that might have mattered most had already closed. Police cleared Jessica's father early. Phone records confirmed Jeremiah had been in Missouri the entire day. The family was cooperative from the very first hour, providing DNA samples without hesitation. Jessica's parents stepped in front of cameras 4 days after she disappeared, visibly exhausted, still holding on to whatever hope they had left. "She's my rock. She's all of our rock. I try to stay positive. It's hard. I just want to find my daughter." I watched her walk out the door, and I shut the door, and that's the last time I saw her. Working theory among investigators had solidified fast. This was a stranger abduction. Not a runaway, not a family matter. Someone had taken her. Back at Witt Elementary, when officers searched Jessica's desk, they found something that stopped them cold. Her homework was done, everything in order, and on one of the pages in her notebook, in her own handwriting, she had written, "Don't play in the park alone and be careful of strangers." She knew. She was careful. She was aware, which told investigators something important. The idea that Jessica would have willingly approached someone she didn't trust simply didn't hold. Whoever had taken her had either been someone she recognized or had moved faster than she had any chance to react. That notebook page haunted a lot of people who worked this case. Here was a 10-year-old girl who had, in her own handwriting, written down exactly the kind of warning she'd been taught to follow. And she'd still been taken, in broad daylight, on a route she'd walked dozens of times before, in a neighborhood where her family felt completely safe leaving her to walk alone. The note didn't mean she'd been careless. It meant that whatever happened, it happened faster than any amount of awareness could have stopped. Within hours, Westminster looked like a city at war with the dark. Firefighters dragged out thermal imaging equipment and flooded Chelsea Park with powerful lights. Police wanted to deploy a helicopter with night vision, but the temperature had dropped so low there was real risk of ice forming on the rotor blades, too dangerous to fly. So they worked the ground, methodically, through the dark and cold. They were not alone. Volunteers showed up in numbers nobody had anticipated. Officers and civilians moving together through backyards, open fields, creek beds, wooded stretches, anywhere a child could be hidden or lost. Every vehicle entering or leaving the neighborhood was photographed. Officers stood at crosswalks around the clock. And across Westminster, something quiet and collective started happening in the community. Mailboxes, telephone poles, tree trunks along the walking paths, all of them wrapped in purple ribbons, Jessica's favorite color. The community wasn't just watching, it was moving. Around 2 a.m., authorities asked the volunteers to rest and return at sunrise. By then, the Westminster Police Department had established a formal command center and called in reinforcements. The FBI stepped in. 12 other agencies followed. In the end, more than 1,000 people would work this case, grinding through over 4,000 tips. The scale of what was being mobilized tells you something about how investigators read this situation from very early on. This wasn't treated as a runaway or a misunderstanding. From almost the first hour, the people running this search were operating with the quiet, professional urgency of people who understood what was most likely happening. Over 400 faculty members and parents connected to Witt Elementary received notifications. Parents started walking their children to school personally or holding them home entirely. A neighborhood that had felt entirely safe the week before was suddenly somewhere people were locking their doors in the middle of the day. The tip line fielded hundreds of calls. Investigators followed up on every single one. They went door to door. They checked sex offender registries. They pulled cell tower data from key locations, trying to find any device that had registered near multiple sites connected to the case. A psychological profile was developed and shared with the public. White male, likely between the ages of 18 and 30, average build. Nothing concrete came back fast enough. And the search, for all its size and effort, was producing silence. It's worth sitting with just how thorough this operation actually was, because the scale of it is genuinely unusual even by the standards of high-profile missing children cases. More than 50 police officers worked the first night alone. Within 24 hours, the FBI was embedded. Within 48 hours, 12 additional agencies had joined the effort. In the end, more than 1,000 people, trained investigators, forensic specialists, search and rescue professionals, and community volunteers would work this case before it closed. That's not a statistic. That's an entire city throwing everything it had at one question. The answer to that question, as it turned out, was less than half a mile away the entire time. Pattern interrupt. Hold a beat before the next section. The scale of the search and the silence it produced should sit heavy before the first discovery. Quick question. Where are you watching this from today? I always like picturing where everyone's tuning in. Now here's something I need you to hold before we go any further. For the 19 days this case was active, investigators were working one of the largest coordinated searches in Colorado history, and the person responsible for what happened to Jessica was living less than half a mile from her own home the entire time. Officers knocked on his door. They spoke to him directly. They collected his DNA. And then, because of a quiet administrative failure that nobody caught in time, his DNA sample was never actually processed. He was cleared by accident, for days. On October 7th, 2 days after Jessica disappeared, a man going about his day came across something. A backpack, left in a subdivision about 6 miles from her home. Inside, glasses, a water bottle, a piece of clothing. He didn't immediately connect it to the search happening across town, so he posted about it online. Someone else made the connection and called 911. When Sarah heard about the backpack, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. A flicker of hope. Fragile and desperate, but real. Maybe Jessica was still out there. Maybe she was alive. That hope lasted less than 24 hours. The following day, maintenance workers came across a heavy bag sitting along the side of a road, also roughly 6 miles from Jessica's home. They didn't open it. They called authorities immediately. What investigators found inside is something no true crime script should describe in graphic detail. But what the forensic results confirmed was that Jessica Ridgeway had been found, and that she had not survived. Police confirmed it publicly on the evening of October 10th, 5 days after she disappeared. Westminster Police Chief Lee Burke addressed the city with words that landed like a weight across an entire community. Our focus has shifted from searching for Jessica to seeking justice for Jessica. We understand that there is a perpetrator at large in our community. A wooden cross had also been recovered near the scene. Investigators described it as a critical piece of evidence, though at the time they kept the specific details close. Hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil in the days that followed. A memorial service in Arvada drew more than 3,000 people, with Jessica's favorite songs filling the space, and a video of her playing on screen. The crowd was a sea of purple. Officers who had worked the search stood alongside families who had never met Jessica, but felt the weight of her absence all the same. There is something specific that happens to a community when a case like this reaches an outcome like this. Something that doesn't register fully in news coverage, but that people who live through it describe consistently. It's not just grief, though it is that. It's a rearrangement of the world as it felt before. The neighborhood that had seemed completely safe on October 4th was a fundamentally different place on October 11th, and no amount of investigation or justice restores what that shift takes away. Parents who had let their kids walk to school alone started driving them. Families who'd left the front door unlocked started locking it. Children who had played freely in Chelsea Park started getting escorted everywhere they went. The search was over. The investigation had just truly begun. I want to pause here for a second, because what comes next in this case is genuinely one of the stranger investigative turns I've covered on this channel. A DNA sample that should have cracked this case open days earlier. An administrative failure nobody caught until the damage was done. And a confession that came not from a detective's interrogation, but from a mother sitting at home with her son. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me right now, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. This next stretch moves fast. As investigators worked the case, something surfaced that fundamentally changed how they understood what they were looking at. 4 months earlier, on May 28, 2012, Memorial Day, a 22-year-old woman had been jogging near Kettner Lake in Westminster when a man came at her from behind. He pressed a cloth treated with a chemical over her face, dragged her into nearby bushes. She fought back, broke free, and ran. She called 911 immediately. The description she gave was limited. A white male, roughly 5'8", average build, somewhere between 18 and 30. It had been treated as an isolated, frightening incident. No match in any database, no suspect identified, no immediate connection to anything larger. What nobody knew yet was that the attack hadn't happened anywhere near randomly. It had occurred just steps from where Jessica was believed to have been taken. When DNA evidence recovered from the Kettner Lake scene was cross-referenced with evidence from Jessica's case, the match was exact. Same perpetrator. 2 incidents, 4 months apart. The attempted attack on the jogger wasn't a random crime unconnected to everything else. It was a rehearsal. FBI spokesperson Dave Jolie told the public plainly, everyone needed to remain at maximum alert. A detailed behavioral profile was released alongside the DNA connection. Investigators asked the public to watch for specific behavioral changes in people they knew. Changes in appearance, altered routines, unusual behavior in the days since Jessica's disappearance. Because the leading theory, confirmed by FBI behavioral analysts, was that this was someone in the community, someone's neighbor, someone's family member. The net was tightening, but the person at the center of it was still out there. The behavioral profile FBI analysts released to the public during this stretch of the investigation was unusually specific for cases at this stage. They weren't just asking people to call in with names. They were asking the community to look for behavioral changes in people they already knew. Someone shaving a beard or changing their hair. Someone parking their car in the garage when they'd always left it in the driveway. Someone whose mood or routine had shifted noticeably in the days since October 5th. The reasoning behind that request is important. Investigators had concluded, with real confidence, that this was someone local, not a passing stranger. Someone the community had already been living alongside, going to the grocery store with, seeing at the park. What they were asking the public to do was essentially look sideways at their own neighbors and ask whether anyone seemed different now, and why. That's a deeply uncomfortable thing to ask a community to do. It also turned out to be exactly the right ask. If you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button, because what's coming next is the moment this case broke completely open. And it didn't happen the way most true crime cases do. There was no dramatic confrontation, no officer piecing together the last clue under pressure. It started with a neighbor recognizing a cross in a photograph. It ended with a mother picking up a phone and doing the hardest thing a parent can ever be asked to do. Stick around, because this next section does not let up. After investigators released images of the wooden cross found near the scene, a neighbor came forward. She lived near a family she knew, Mindy Sigg and her son Austin. The cross in the photograph looked almost identical to one Austin owned. But that wasn't all she mentioned. She told the FBI that Austin had a deeply troubling, long-standing obsession with death, specifically with decomposition, with how living things break down over time. It was something people around him had quietly noticed for years, without knowing what to do with it. Investigators brought Austin in for questioning. He was calm, cooperative even. He said he'd been home asleep the day Jessica disappeared. He agreed without hesitation to provide a DNA sample. Agents noted he was wearing a cross nearly identical to the one in the photographs. His answer seemed to hold. They collected the swab, logged it, and continued working door to door through the neighborhood. Standard procedure for a search of this scale. Standard procedure in these cases is to return DNA results in sealed envelopes. An empty envelope means no match. The sample was either insufficient or the comparison didn't connect. Austin Sigg's envelope came back empty. He was removed from the active radar. Except the envelope wasn't a cleared result. It was an administrative failure. Somewhere between collection and processing, the sample was lost. Nobody caught it in time. Austin Sigg had provided his DNA willingly, and because of a clerical error that went undetected, he walked away cleared by accident. On October 22nd, news coverage intensified around the DNA connection between Jessica's case and the earlier jogger attack. That same evening, Austin told his classmates he felt violently ill. That night, he slept in his mother's bed, and the next morning, he told Mindy he needed to confess something. She looked at him. Before he said another word, she already knew. "Is this about Jessica?" "I just knew," she would later say. "I don't know how, I just knew." When he confirmed it, Mindy collapsed to the floor, sobbing, shaking, the same words looping through her head. "This can't be happening." Austin told her he was going to prison. "I know," she said. "You need to call the police. Can you do it for me?" Mindy picked up the phone. The 911 call that followed lasted nearly 18 minutes. She told the dispatcher her son wanted to turn himself in for the Jessica Ridgeway murder. She told them his remains were in the house. She could barely breathe. The dispatcher tried to keep her calm while officers were already en route. At one point, the dispatcher asked to speak with Austin directly. "Is this Austin?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what's going on?" "I don't exactly get why you're asking these questions. I murdered Jessica Ridgeway. There is no other question. You just have to send a car down here." 19 days after Jessica walked out her front door for the last time, Austin Sigg walked into a Westminster police station. A second DNA analysis was ordered immediately. The result came back fast and unambiguous. Austin Sigg's DNA matched evidence from both Kettner Lake and Jessica's case. When his Jeep was processed, investigators found restraints inside consistent with everything he'd described. Every piece had locked into place. The administrative failure with the original DNA sample is one of the details in this case that's genuinely hard to sit with, because of what it cost in time. Austin Sigg had provided that sample voluntarily. He walked into an interview room, answered questions calmly, handed over a swab without hesitation, and left. And somewhere between collection and the lab, the sample simply vanished from the system, returned as an empty envelope that, under standard procedure, read the same as a cleared result. Nobody flagged it as an error. Nobody followed up to confirm the sample had actually been processed. For several days after that, while investigators continued working through thousands of tips and hundreds of square miles, Austin Sigg's name was off the list. In a search of that size and complexity, one cleared name doesn't feel significant in the moment. In hindsight, it represents approximately a week between when investigators might have closed in and when they actually did. What came out during the interrogation is the kind of thing that stays with you, not just because of the details, but because of how he delivered them. Flat, composed, almost clinical, like he was recounting something he'd read about rather than something he had done. Austin confessed to the Kettner Lake attack first. He described approaching the jogger from behind, pressing a treated cloth over her face. When she broke free and escaped, he wasn't deterred. He told investigators the failed attempt made him reconsider his approach entirely. He believed he needed a smaller, more vulnerable target. When investigators asked what he would have done if the woman hadn't escaped, Austin answered without hesitation. Probably the same thing I did to Jessica. He then walked them through October 5th. So you were out, for a better word, hunting? Yeah, that's the word I think of. Jessica had been in Chelsea Park that morning, packing snowballs, just being a kid. Austin had been watching from nearby. He positioned his Jeep in a spot where it wouldn't draw attention, and waited. When she walked past, he acted. She screamed. There was no one close enough to hear her. He drove her to his home. Random place, random time. He told investigators, the second I pulled her into the car, I already knew what was going to happen. At the house, he said he turned on cartoons and told her everything was going to be okay, that she'd be going home to her mom soon. Jessica, 10 years old and terrified, kept asking who he was, whether he knew her mom. He answered her. He lied to her face, over and over, while she sat there watching television. What happened next inside that house is something this script will not linger on. Jessica was assaulted and murdered there. She was 10 years old. She never made it home. The full scope of what she endured is something investigators understood far more completely than Austin was ever willing to fully admit, and it formed the basis for the charges that would follow. He then took deliberate, calculated steps to conceal what he had done, steps that reflected not panic, but planning. Investigators found evidence of his attempts to eliminate physical traces throughout the property. They found remaining evidence concealed beneath the house in a crawl space, exactly where Austin later directed them to look. A psychologist who reviewed the full case file was direct in her assessment during the sentencing hearing. She called Austin Sigg a sadistic torturer. She stated plainly that there was no remorse, no compassion shown toward Jessica, during or after. She told the court that Austin himself had said the moment she was in the car, he knew she was dead. He had told investigators that people who successfully carry out multiple crimes are the ones who know how to eliminate evidence. He researched it. He studied forensic methods specifically to understand how investigators work and how to stay ahead of them. He was 17 years old when he did all of this. Investigators later confirmed that Austin had researched how to synthesize a chemical capable of rendering someone unconscious, the same approach he'd used at Kettner Lake months earlier. He had searched online for locations where people were most vulnerable. He had looked into how crime scenes are processed and what kinds of physical evidence are hardest to eliminate. This was not a teenager who snapped in a moment of uncontrolled rage and then panicked. This was a teenager who had spent months planning an approach, tested it once, refined it when it didn't work, and tried again. To understand what happened to Jessica, you have to try, uncomfortable as it is, to understand the person who took her. Not to excuse anything, not to explain it away, but because the warning signs were scattered across years, and they went unanswered long enough for the worst possible outcome to unfold. Austin Sigg grew up in Westminster. His parents, Mindy and Robert, divorced at some point during his childhood, though by most accounts both remained involved in his life. In 2008, when Austin was around 13, his behavior raised enough concern that his parents took him to a faith-based counselor. Austin later said it helped for about a month before everything came rushing back, worse than before. By 2009, his doctors were sufficiently alarmed to contact his father directly and urge him to restrict Austin's access to television and computers. Austin was 14 at the time. He later told investigators his exposure to deeply disturbing illegal online content had begun when he was 12. What he consumed over those years wasn't just troubling, it was escalating, increasingly violent material that he described as something he couldn't stop seeking out. Alongside that, a fixation on death had been quietly building for years. A former classmate who had known him since middle school described Austin as clearly intelligent but deeply withdrawn, someone who talked to himself, struggled with basic social interaction, and carried an energy that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. He was bullied, partly over his voice, and eventually stepped away from traditional school, earning his equivalency certificate independently. He then enrolled at a community college and began studying mortuary science, wanting to work professionally with the deceased. In the context of everything investigators would later learn about him, that detail is a difficult one to sit with. One neighbor, Emily Alexander, shared something that has stayed with a lot of people who followed this case. When news broke about Jessica's disappearance, Emily's 11-year-old daughter came straight to her and said she knew who had done it. A teenage boy she'd seen acting strangely near the park down the road, staring at children walking past. Emily admitted she brushed it off in the moment. When Austin was arrested not long after, that conversation came rushing back with full force. Even a child had seen something the adults around him had chosen not to look at directly. The defense at sentencing argued that Austin's actions were shaped by circumstances beyond his control, complications during Mindy's pregnancy, difficult experiences at birth, surgeries in early childhood, his father Robert's documented history of serious legal troubles. They argued his age and developmental stage made him unable to fully understand what he was doing. The psychologist who testified for the prosecution was unambiguous in response. There was no evidence Austin had been abused as a child, and his home life, while imperfect, had been relatively stable. He'd had access to professional help. He'd had family support. He'd had a mother who, the moment she understood what he'd done, picked up the phone and turned him in, which is an act of extraordinary moral courage that most parents in her position would have been incapable of. None of it had redirected what was building inside him. The psychologist told the court that this was not someone who had acted impulsively. This was not someone who expressed anything that looked like genuine remorse. Austin Sigg had spent years mentally and practically arriving at October 5, 2012. The day itself didn't produce the person he was. It revealed him. Chief Deputy DA Hal Sargent put it plainly to the court. Something is very broken in Austin Sigg. It was not something his mother did or did not do. There is something simply broken in him that can't be fixed. On October 30, 2012, Austin Sigg was formally charged as an adult. 17 counts in total, covering the full scope of what he had done to Jessica and the charges tied to the attack on the jogger at Kettner Lake. He entered a plea of not guilty to everything. Given his detailed confession, given that Jessica's remains had been recovered at his home, given the physical evidence found throughout the property and his vehicle, that plea stunned a lot of people who had been following the case. The thought of a full trial, of having every last detail aired publicly, of Jessica's family having to sit through weeks of proceedings, felt almost unbearable. His defense team went to work constructing every available argument that Austin was too young, too developmentally compromised, too shaped by his circumstances to be fully culpable in the legal sense. Prosecutors weren't moved. Then on October 1, 2013, almost exactly 1 year after Jessica left for school, and just 2 days before the trial was set to begin, Austin Sigg changed his plea. Against his own attorney's advice, he stood up and pleaded guilty to 15 charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault of a minor, attempted kidnapping, and sexual exploitation of a minor. He also acknowledged the Kettner Lake attack. He entered those pleas without a single concession. No agreement negotiated with prosecutors. No deal made in exchange for anything. On November 19, 2013, Judge Stephen Munsinger sentenced him in a Jefferson County courtroom. Life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 40 years on the murder charge. An additional 86 years for the remaining counts, a figure calculated specifically to eliminate any realistic possibility that the parole provision on the murder charge would ever matter. Before the sentence was handed down, the judge addressed the courtroom directly. Evil is apparently real. It was present in our community on October 5, 2012. Its name was Austin Sigg. Austin stood in that courtroom and said nothing. No statement, no acknowledgement of the family sitting in the same room. His face showed no emotion as the sentence was read aloud. The defense had argued throughout the sentencing proceedings that Colorado law required a sentence allowing parole eligibility after 40 years, citing U.S. and state Supreme Court rulings protecting juvenile defendants from mandatory life without parole. Judge Munsinger acknowledged that constraint. He then sentenced Austin to the additional 86 years specifically designed to ensure the parole provision on the murder charge would never operate in practice. The legal mechanism was available. The judge used it deliberately and without ambiguity. District Attorney Scott Story was equally clear in his public statement. There had been no concessions, no plea arrangement, no leniency of any kind. Austin Sigg had entered his guilty plea against his attorney's advice, without getting anything in return, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In June 2014, he was transferred to an undisclosed out-of-state facility, both for his own safety and to preserve the Ridgeway family's privacy. He has remained there since. Sarah Ridgeway spoke last at the sentencing. She told the judge that Austin Sigg didn't deserve to know how his actions had affected her family, or who Jessica was. And then she said something that stayed with everyone in that room. Once we walk out of this courtroom, we'll not remember his name. We'll only remember Jessica and the legacy she created. Jessica's mother, Sarah, described her daughter's death once in words that have stayed with a lot of people who heard them. She said it was like a plate shattering, with one piece lost forever. You can try to glue it back together, she said, but the cracks never go away. It will never be whole again, no matter how hard you try. 5 years after losing Jessica, Sarah gave birth to a little girl named Anna. She has said she believes Jessica watches over her family in a different way now, present in the quiet moments, in the way her younger daughter sometimes seems to be looking at something just past the edge of the room, as if someone is there. She keeps purple everywhere in the house, still. Mindy Sigg, the mother who made that 18-minute call to 911 and turned her own son in, said she never once regretted that decision, not for a single moment. She threw herself fully into therapy and worked to rebuild her life piece by piece. She still thinks about Austin. She still mourns the child she raised, but she has not spoken to him since the day he was arrested, and he has never reached out to her. In a rare interview given to CNN in October 2025, Mindy spoke publicly about those years for the first time. She said she still couldn't allow Austin to lie to her, that she never got the answer to the question she most needed, why, and that she needed at least something before she could ever consider any kind of contact with him again. She also said something that will probably stay with anyone who hears it, that she went to every hearing after his arrest, often accompanied by family and friends, because she needed to know what happened and what was going to happen. Not to support her son, to understand the full scope of what he'd done and make sure he was held accountable for all of it. When asked what she would say to Jessica's family, Mindy didn't hesitate. She said she would literally give her life to change what happened, that she would trade places with Jessica in a heartbeat. Jessica's grandmother responded to that with words that quietly moved a courtroom when they were shared during the sentencing hearing. "We understand that she lost her son too," she said. "It's a different kind of loss, but she still lost him. My heart goes out to her. If we'd been allowed to hug her in court, we probably would have." The community Jessica grew up in never stopped honoring her memory. A memorial playground was built in her name, designed around things she loved. Knock-knock jokes engraved by her classmates. Dragonfly features tied to a school project she'd been working on the week she disappeared. Everything in purple. A place built specifically so children could play, laugh, and be safe in a neighborhood that had learned the hardest possible way that safety can't be assumed. The Lassie Project, inspired by her case, provides a free service helping parents alert their entire local community within seconds the moment a child goes missing. Exactly the kind of rapid, community-level response that might have made a difference in those first critical hours of October 5th, 2012. And there's a cheerleading camp that bears her name too, because she'd made her mother a promise once that she was going to be a cheerleader who was kind to everyone, no matter what. That was Jessica. Right up to the very end, that's exactly who she was. It's worth ending this case the way these things should always end. Not on the person who committed the crime, but on the one who was taken. Because Austin Sigg will spend the rest of his life in a facility somewhere that most people will never know the name of, and his story, grim as it is already largely told. But Jessica's story keeps going. It goes in the purple ribbons her community still ties to trees. In Anna, her little sister, who is growing up knowing she has a big sister who left before she was born. In the playground where Westminster kids can knock on the knock-knock joke panels her classmates engraved and swing on swings where purple ribbons still flutter on the right kind of afternoon. Some cases end in a courtroom. Some end with legislation. Some end in a single moment that closes one chapter and opens another. Jessica's case ended in all of those ways, and none of them, because the end of a case and the end of a loss are two entirely different things, and for Sarah, for Anna, for the friends who sat beside her in a fifth-grade classroom and never saw her again, what happened on October 5th, 2012, doesn't really end at all. It just becomes part of how they move through the world. If this case got to you the way it gets to most people who sit with it for any amount of time, do 3 things before you go. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which part of this story stayed with you most, and share it with someone. Because Jessica's story is also the reason communities now have tools like the Lassie Project, and those tools only keep working if people know they exist. Here's what I keep coming back to with this one. The investigation into Jessica's disappearance eventually produced the arrest, the conviction, and the sentence that the evidence called for. 1,000 people searched for her. 4,000 tips got followed up. The system, in the narrow legal sense, did what it was designed to do. But Jessica was already gone. She was gone within hours of leaving her front door. And the person responsible had been in that neighborhood the whole time, had been seen by a child down the street who told her mother and wasn't believed, had been documented by doctors who sent letters of concern that went unanswered, had been seen in the park by neighbors who noticed something was off and didn't know what to do with that feeling. Jessica Ridgeway was 10 years old. She loved purple. She wore pink glasses. She was going to be a zombie lifeguard for Halloween. She deserved every single year she never got to live. That's the case. I'll see you in the next one.